Hi. So today, since it's 4th of July, I was going to share a presentation that I created back on June 3rd at the Chippewa Valley Museum. It is regarding my grandfather, Arlo Matthijs, and his experience in World War II in Germany. And so this is my grandfather, Arlo George Matthijs, and he was born on December 1st, 1917, in the town of Augusta, Wisconsin, actually Bridge Creek. He was born, I believe, in a farm, and that's him when he was a kid. He had little brothers and family. As a genealogist, this is my family tree, actually Arlo's family tree, and as you can see, um, what's interesting is both George Matthijs, his grandfather, and then also his great-grandfather, um, William Tarbox, they were both Civil War veterans. And so he actually grew up more likely listening to stories about the American Civil War. They both fought for the North. I believe they both fought for New York infantries. Um, and then in 1936, he graduated from Eau Claire High School. He was very involved in certain groups like boxing and rifle club, and he was very much in the athletics. He loved hockey and football and most importantly, golf. He was a golfer even back then. And this is his draft card. As you This is one thing I brought up regarding genealogy and primary sources. If you see here, it says Mrs. Lida Matthijs' wife. That was actually his mom, but that's an example of how even primary sources, how it's important to know about the person and their family members when you're doing resources like this, when you're finding primary sources. And one thing that I found that was kinda interesting with doing some research. Now, I grew up listening to stories about my grandpa, Arlo, and his war history. I never knew this, but he was actually drafted in the Army. I always thought he had enlisted, but no, he actually was one of the first draftees in Eau Claire. To be sent to actually to be not necessarily going right to Germany. Um, and what I thought was kind of interesting, if you see Arlo George Matthijs in the number 1275 and his address, if you go back, that was the order number of his draft card. So, during that same time, before he was even drafted, he met my grandmother. They had friends in common. He graduated high school before she did, but they knew people, and they had a long relationship. And after he got drafted and got kind of settled in the army, he came back, and they were married. They were actually married down by Wisconsin Dells, and this is um, an example of their marriage certificate and or their marriage registration. And if you look here, it says Arlo George Matthijs, and it also says where he was at that time. He was actually in Virginia. He was stationed there. When doing research about your World War II ancestors, one of the most important papers you can come across is their discharge form. Today we call it a DD 214. I was lucky enough that when, family was going through the house, my grandma's house, my dad came across my grandpa's discharge paper, knowing that how important it was, my dad kept it. Nobody really seemed to mind that because they knew my dad would take care of it, and he sure enough did. With that comes a lot of information, um, and where to find these is maybe to start with the county VA office. Sometimes they have this information. Also VFWs, Veterans of Foreign War, they may have past copies as well, because in order to actually become a member of it, you had to prove that you were a veteran of a foreign war. So what I did to really learn about my grandpa's World War II history was to kind of just completely dissect this form. And I'll start off with just kind of mentioning the first part, which is his name, his army serial number, his rank, um, what army he was in, infantry. This part, the component, that actually AUS actually stands for Army of the United States of America, or the Army of the United States. And then also it says organization company B, 3 that's the most important one, or somewhat of one of the most important information in this area is what organization he belonged to. Company B, 346th Infantry Regiment, 87th Division. That tells me a lot. Um, Place of separation, that was just the last place he was in before he was discharged. And so as you can see, it shows that his height changed. Him in his discharge, in his draft card, it said he was 6 foot. Here it says he's 5'11". So apparently war shrinks people. Um, and so kind of like the real meats and potatoes of learning about your ancestors' war history really comes in this part called the military history. And I'll start off with really focusing first on the battles and campaigns. Um, so battles and campaigns for my grandfather, it says Rhineland, Ardennes, and Central Europe. So the Rhineland was pretty much Germany, and that was from September of 1944 to 1945. Most battles were fought between that time, and that took place in northeast France and western Germany. The Ardennes campaign, most commonly referred to as Battle of the Bulge, um, that took place in Belgium and Luxembourg. And then Central Europe was pretty much after Battle of the Bulge when they pushed into Germany, um, and that was, Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Now, combat in World War II was different from any other time of war before then, because before then, when you would have battles, and then you would have, like, just rest. World War II was different where it was, and taking Germany first specifically, every day was a battle. Every day it was just constant fighting, period. So instead of having to define a certain battle, they created campaigns, which really compacted a time and a place of constant fighting. So that's why you get the Rhineland, Ardennes, and Central Europe. So the next part is decorations. Decorations could be medals, ribbons. Sometimes medals didn't have ribbons. Sometimes ribbons didn't have medals. Oak leaf cluster was used when there was 3 of the same medal awarded 3 times. Most were not given until discharge. So this is an example of my grandpa's uniform. And so you learn a lot about your ancestors' experience by finding out which decorations and citations they earned while they were in service. Examples, the ETO ribbon was the European, African, Middle Eastern campaign. It was awarded for pretty much any serviceman who was in the Eastern Theater, Europe. Think about that. Between December 7th, 1941 and November of 1945. The American Defense Ribbon was unique for it was for all persons active duty between September 8th of 1939 and December 7th, 1941. So what was kind of interesting, again, not only did I learn that my grandfather was drafted in the army, but that he actually was drafted in July of 1941. So before Pearl Harbor was bombed, they were drafting men into the US Army for defense. And actually, he actually started off and where my mom was born was out in California as well, because that's where many of them were stationed. So he also received the Purple Heart, the Oak Leaf Cluster, um, which means that he was injured. He was wounded 3 times. It's the oldest decoration, dating back to the Revolutionary War, and what we will probably get into later is talking about how important it was to notify people about injuries, regardless of how little they were. At the beginning of the war, guys would get injured, like, with the shrapnel, and they wouldn't report it, and they learned later that that wasn't a good idea. I'll get into it later, but also Bronze Star. My grandfather earned 3 Bronze Star campaign stars. So it was acts of heroism, lesser than a Silver Star or Medal of Honor. The V indicated valor. Um, and could be awarded for pretty much anything. And actually, by the end of the war, they ended up deciding that every man, every person who was stationed in a combat zone was awarded the Bronze Star, because regardless of who you were, if you were in combat, you obviously were brave enough, period, to at least be there. My grandfather also received the Good Conduct Ribbon, and this was only awarded to enlisted men. And it was originally for only 3 years of service, but after 43, they gave it to soldiers who had 1 year of service. Most were um, awarded by commanding officers. And the interesting thing is also some soldiers actually saw it as an honor not to get it because they were rebels. And then also my grandfather had the expert infantry badge, combat infantry badge as well. And that's pretty much the soldier would study and work really hard and would pass a test that would allow them to be experts at a certain gun. And he was an expert at both rifle and combine and coast artillery. And the coast artillery was from when he was stationed in California. And so wounds received. This details about where the wound was received. And actually, with those, you can kind of get an idea of where the soldier, where the ancestor was wounded um, on the battlefield, or which battle, which campaign they were wounded in. I know he was wounded in December 11th, 1944, France. That was around Battle of the Bulge. And then on April 12th, 45 in Germany. So that was when he was in the Central Campaign. Now, I am a public health nurse and I deal a lot with immunizations. I am a big supporter of them. And one of the reasons why is because of my military war background history. Immunizations were really important in World War II. They um they the reason why we had immunizations was not just to um I want to pause this. I can't. All right. Well, um I'll see if hold on. I can. So I'm not AI, because AI would never be this bad at presenting. So anyway, getting back to immunizations. The reason why they had these on the discharge papers is not just it was really for the community they were coming back to guarantee, look, this particular soldier was vaccinated for these things. So we know that he's not bringing typhoid back to Eau Claire, Wisconsin when he comes back. The other reason why it was really important to use vaccines and immunizations was actually for prisoners of war. And well, that was one reason. Um, because one of the ways that the enemy would kill off prisoners of war is sometimes they would actually send typhus into prison camps with the intent to hopefully the soldiers would die so they wouldn't be required to feed them and take care of them, um, because of the Geneva because of the ethical, laws in place that they didn't really follow anyway. Um, so that was a so it's really important to remember that vaccines are very important. Good. Service outside the continental US and return. So this is really saying that he was in combat, total length of service, and so this is the date he left the US coast and traveled to Europe, and then the date he arrived in Europe, which was actually in England. And then May 31st, 1945 was the date he left Europe to come back to the United States, and June 11th was the date he arrived in the United States. And this gives more information as well. This is reasons, a certificate of disability for discharge, so it's saying that he was discharged. Also, it talks about different schools he was in, aviation cadet, March of 1944. It also talks about how much education he had. And then, this is really the pay information is important to remember because the people who joined the military were doing it also with the intent that they would get reimbursed for their services. They signed a contract saying that they would get paid for their work in the military, and this was proof of what was owed to my grandfather when he left. Um, there is let's see where that is, and that shows the amount of money he was earned. And let me go back here. Um, so here is something. So this is more information. No time lost under Articles of War 107. That means that my grandfather had no unexcused absences, such as getting drunk and not showing up for duty. So he showed up for duty all the time. Lapel button issued. There was a something called the ruptured duck lapel pin saying that you're done, you're out of the military service. Um, and also the ASR score of September 2nd, 1945 was 96. So what that means was near the end of the war, they um they needed to figure out a way of how to triage which soldiers were sent home as the war started to kind of dissipate. And what they did is they created a plan of points. So if you were married, you got 12 points. If you had a child, every kid was worth 6 points after that. And if you, and this goes back to if you were injured, every wound was like 10 points. So all of these points added up. And once you got to 90 points, you were eligible for going home. So that is how they decided how that worked. Now going back to the first part of where he was the organization Company B 346th Infantry. So if you want to do some research on your ancestor, what I did was I took that and I just Googled it and I looked for websites. There is Fold 3. That's part of usually Ancestry. It is an extra cost. Sometimes it's worth it. Sometimes the biggest thing about like Fold 3 that you have to remember is if you really want to get into this, uh pay attention around like 4th of July and Memorial Day, Veterans Day. Usually they have really, really good deals on those days to subscribe. So those are and that might be worth the money there. And then also his division had actually even had uh, a yearbook, and many divisions had yearbooks that within those yearbooks would have things about certain infantries and sometimes even specific companies. And keep in mind, as the division is like thousands of men, the infantry is like a few thousand men, and then companies are like hundreds, and then squads are like 9. Um, so the other thing I use to research my family history is oral history. Stories that my father was told. My dad is a Vietnam vet. And even though it was his son-in-law, my dad and my grandfather got along very well, and my grandpa used to tell him a lot of stories about World War II, about his veteran stories, probably because he was telling another veteran. And then I also was able to meet out with certain aunts and uncles and friends. But what really helped me, which I will totally say I am extremely lucky, is I was able to find all the letters that my grandfather sent my grandma during World War II. When they were cleaning out my grandma's house when she went to the nursing home, I actually came across them, and I thank myself every day that I took those out of the garbage and I kept them. And I'm going to go through a few of them because I think it's really important at this time to remember why it's important to learn about primary sources and to be remembered as to what our ancestors went through when it came to war. I'm just gonna throw a few things that really got me when reading these letters, saying war is hell, Elaine. I can't see how people do such things as fight. Um, this is also on March 8th, 1945, somewhere in Germany. At the time, we were just entering the Siegfried line. This helped me figure out little things where it's like, oh my gosh, I learned where in Europe he was when and where. And he also talks a lot and laments about being a soldier. And this is the other thing that's really important about primary sources about soldiers, especially somebody like my grandpa, who was an enlisted man, who was drafted, um, who had no intentions of staying in the army. He didn't do it as an occupation, he did it as a civic duty. So they have a different perspective than a lot of the perspectives that we get from historical records, which is usually officers, which is usually people who um, are really doing it with the intent to publicize their experience. These are personal letters. They're not meant to be um trying to persuade any public of an opinion. It's almost like a diary. I mean, all he's doing is writing with the intent to talk to my grandmother. And some of the things that he talked about as a soldier is, I just want to settle down and live peacefully the rest of my life. My natural life in an ordinary as an ordinary person in ordinary times. And then that's my dog, if you can hear her. Some more information that I thought was really interesting is this letter goes into details as to where he was, his squad, or should I say my platoon, to the city of Stagkill, was just in charge of the patrol. Now, here's the other thing that we learn about um, soldiers and enlisted men, the history of just average everyday enlisted men who are on the battlefield, is that officers had more rights than the enlisted men. And there are many things that happen where the enlisted men did all the work, but the people in charge got all the glory. And so it's kinda interesting reading these stories because it's obvious that he and his other soldiers, his platoon, did a lot of work, but you don't see that, you don't hear that because depending on whoever was in charge would disregard it. They would consider it was them who did it, not the people who actually did do it. And a great resource is after action reports, and I was lucky enough that I found some on the website, was the after action report where, they found on the 87th Infantry website that I found, obtained in the archives about June 6, 1945. It talks about that particular city. I was also very lucky that on February 12th, he wrote to my grandmother and told her exactly all where he had been, broke down all the battles he was in, the wounds he had, and the armies. And as you can see, he talks on the discharge papers, it only mentions 2 times and dates, 2 times and places. And here it says ear scratched and wound on chin. This is before he had his 3rd and final wound. So it goes to show you where he got the gold cluster. But it also talks about the different armies he was in to understand that men got shifted around constantly, uh, because you had to have so many men in a squad or a platoon, and so if they went into a battle and multiple men got injured, killed, they would have to replace those, and so they would move men around, and certain squads would be discontinued because, um many men would be wounded or killed. And my grandfather even talked about in a letter about how he was in a platoon or a squad where they went into a battle and there were all these men and only there were like 900 men that went in and there was only like 50 that came out alive and he was one of them. Um And I actually that I have to look into, but apparently there's a story about Patton creating a going into a battle, starting a battle, knowing it wasn't a good idea. Well, I'll just stop right there because um, I'll find out for sure. But there's a story about Patton losing a lot of men on some stupid idea. Um, well, this is the map of the 87th Infantry Division. And what is kinda interesting for me on this map is based on the dates that are there, like, if you see April 13th, 1945, and it's right here. With that, knowing and this is April 5th, 1945, so my grandfather would have probably been shot somewhere in between there, when he was injured. So when he was injured, he was injured on April 12th, 1945, and once he was settled down in a hospital, he wrote my grandmother a huge long letter, and in it described his entire experience of getting shot, what happened before and after. Um, One thing he also talks about is kind of code for dying. The soldiers would say that refer to their families back home getting $10,000. That was code for, getting killed on the battlefield, and how it came from is the life insurance policy that the soldiers would sign before they went into battle would guarantee $10,000, to the soldier's family if they were killed in battle, so that's where they get that. VE Day, I was lucky enough to find the letter my grandpa sent my grandmother on Wednesday, May 8th, 1945. And one thing that I thought was really cute in it, actually cute, I will assault and invade that country. And he was talking about the United States, even though not like being kind of sarcastic. I will assault and invade that country until I get to that little place in Wisconsin called Eau Claire. And, Eventually, he did head back, as you can tell, remember with the dates when he was returning back to the United States, um, he actually said in some of the letters that he had to wait because after VE Day, the prisoners who were in the prisoner of war camp got first bids to come back to the United States because he was injured in his leg, and he was in a hospital in England. He was doing pretty good. He just had difficulty walking. Um, I'm pretty sure they decided to let him stay in Europe longer than he wanted to, simply because he wasn't somebody who they were worried that he was very comfortable and very well taken care of, as much as he wanted to go home. And he did eventually go home. This is him, my grandpa, my grandma, and that little beautiful little girl was my mom. And as you can see, that's why these guys fight, to come back home to be with their families. And he did make it back and he lived the rest of his life. He unfortunately died in 1976. And you know, like I said, he wasn't a soldier forever. It was being a soldier was only one part of who my grandfather was. He was a carpenter. He was a master carpenter. He was part of the labor union. He was part of the union. He was a roofer. What he would do is he'd buy houses and go in and gut them and fix them up and rent them out. He was also a golfer. He was an amazing golfer, very well known, um, won many, many championships. And he had my uncle, my aunt. Um, he was still married to my grandma. And that is the wedding picture of my mom and my grandfather. Um, they were married she was married in 1974, but in 1976, my grandfather did pass away. He got cancer and he died. And this is more information if you're doing research on your ancestors. Um, it's his gravestone, and then this is an example of what the information looked like when they got the gravestone through the VA. And that is my experience of my quick, even though it was a half an hour, of my grandfather in World War II. And it's why we pay attention to politics so we don't have to repeat history. And we are able to defend our veterans because they defended us. So there you go. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm very proud of my grandfather and his history, and I plan to do more research. Um, so there you go. Happy 4th.